Привет, как дела?
Ничего, нормально. Чем занимаешься?
Я уроки делаю.
Уроки делаешь? Молодец.
small and confining, because their minds are always on one thing: validate me. When you enter the world of the growth mindset leaders, everything changes. It brightens, it expands, it fills with energy, with possibility. You think, gee, that seems like fun. It has never entered my mind to lead a corporation. But when I learned about what these leaders had done, it sounded like the most exciting thing in the world. I've chosen 3 of these leaders to explore as a contrast to the fixed mindset leaders. I chose Jack Welch of General Electric because he is a larger-than-life figure with an ego he held in check. Not your straight-ahead, naturally self-effacing, growth-minded guy. And I chose Lou Gerstner, the man who came in and saved IBM. And Anne Mulcahy, the woman who brought Xerox back to life, as contrasts to Alfred Dunlap and the other turnaround expert. Jack Welch, Lou Gerstner, and Anne Mulcahy are also fascinating because they transformed their companies. They did this by rooting out the fixed mindset and putting a culture of growth and teamwork in its place. With Gerstner and IBM, it's like watching Enron morph into a growth mindset mecca. As growth-minded leaders, they start with a belief in human potential and development, both their own and other people's. Instead of using the company as a vehicle for their greatness, they use it as an engine of growth for themselves, the employees, and the company as a whole. Warren Bennis has said that too many bosses are driven and driving but going nowhere. Not these people. They don't talk royalty. They talk journey, an inclusive, learning-filled, rollicking journey. Jack. Listening, crediting, nurturing. When Jack Welch took over GE in 1980, the company was valued at $14 billion. 20 years later, it was valued by Wall Street at $490 billion. It was the most valuable company in the world. In most cases, expensive gift, which the executives were later billed for. Speaking about AOL executives, a former official said, "You're talking about men who thought they had the right to anything." As these leaders cloaked themselves in the trappings of royalty, surrounded themselves with flatterers who extolled their virtues, and hid from problems, it is no wonder they felt invincible. Their fixed mindset created a magic realm in which the brilliance and perfection of the king were constantly validated. Within that mindset, they were completely fulfilled. Why would they want to step outside that realm to face the uglier reality of warts and failures? As Morgan McCall, in his book High Flyers, points out, unfortunately, people often like the things that work against their growth. People like to use their strengths to achieve quick, dramatic results, even if they aren't developing the new skills they will need later on. People like to believe they are as good as everyone says, and not take their weaknesses as seriously as they might. People don't like to hear bad news or get criticism. There is tremendous risk in leaving what one does well to attempt to master something new. And the fixed mindset makes it seem all that much riskier. Brutal bosses. McCall goes on to point out that when leaders feel they are inherently better than others, they may start to believe that the needs or feelings of the lesser people can be ignored. None of our fixed mindset leaders cared much about the little guy, and many were outright contemptuous of those beneath them on the corporate ladder. Where does this lead? In the guise of keeping people on their toes, these bosses may mistreat workers. Iacocca played painful games with his executives to keep them off balance. Jerry Levin of Time Warner was likened by his colleagues to the brutal Roman Emperor Caligula. Skilling was known for his harsh ridicule of those less intelligent than he. Harvey Hornstein, an expert on corporate leadership, writes in his book Brutal Bosses that this kind of abuse represents the boss's desire to enhance their own feelings of power, competence, and value at the subordinate's expense. Do you remember in our studies how people with the fixed mindset wanted to compare themselves with people who were worse off than they were? The principle is the same, but there is an important difference. These bosses have the power to make people worse off, and when they do, they feel better about themselves. Hornstein describes Paul Kazarian, the former CEO of Sunbeam Oster. He called himself a perfectionist, but that was a euphemism for abuser. He threw things at subordinates when they upset him. One day, the comptroller, after displeasing Mr. Kazarian, saw an orange juice container flying toward him. Sometimes the victims are people the bosses consider to be less talented. This can feed their sense of superiority. But often the victims are the most competent people, because these are the ones who pose the greatest threat to a fixed mindset boss. An engineer at a major aircraft builder, interviewed by Hornstein, talked about his boss. His targets were usually those of us who were most competent. I mean, if you're really concerned about our performance, you don't pick on those who are performing best. But if you're really concerned about your competence, you do. When bosses mete out humiliation, a change comes over the place. Everything starts revolving around pleasing the boss. In Good to Great, Collins notes that in many of his comparison companies, the ones that didn't go from good to great, or that went there and declined again, the leader became the main thing people worried about. The minute a leader allows himself to be the primary reality people worry about, rather than reality being the primary reality, you have a recipe for mediocrity or worse. In the 1960s and 70s, the Chase Manhattan Bank was ruled by David Rockefeller, an excessively controlling leader. According to Collins and Porras in Built to Last, his managers lived day to day in fear of his disapproval. At the end of each day, they breathed a sigh of relief. Whew, one more day gone and I'm not in trouble. Even long past his heyday, senior managers refused to venture a new idea because David might not like it. Ray McDonald of Burroughs, Collins and Porras report, publicly ridiculed managers for mistakes to the point where he inhibited them from innovating. As a result, even though Burroughs was ahead of IBM in the early stages of the computer industry, the company lost out. The same thing happened at Texas Instruments, another leader in the exciting early days of the computer. If they didn't like a presentation, Mark Shepard and Fred Busey would yell, bang on tables, insult the speaker, and hurl things. No wonder their people lost their enterprising spirit. When bosses become controlling and abusive, they put everyone into a fixed mindset. This means that instead of learning, growing, and moving the company forward, everyone starts worrying about being judged. It starts with the boss's worry about being judged, but it winds up being everybody's fear about being judged. It's hard for courage and innovation to survive a company-wide fixed mindset. Growth mindset leaders in action. Andrew Carnegie once said, "I wish to have as my epitaph, 'Here lies a man who was wise enough to bring into his service men who knew more than he.'" Okay, let's open the windows and let some air in. The fixed mindset feels so stifling. Even when those leaders are globe-trotting and hobnobbing with world figures, their world seems so small and confining, because their minds are always on one thing: validate me. When you enter the world of the growth mindset leaders, everything changes. It brightens, it expands, it fills with energy, with possibility. You think, gee, that seems like fun. It has never entered my mind to lead a corporation. But when I learned about what these leaders had done, it sounded like the most exciting thing in the world. I've chosen 3 of these leaders to explore as a contrast to the fixed mindset leaders. I chose Jack Welch of General Electric because he is a larger-than-life figure with an ego he held in check. Not your straight-ahead, naturally self-effacing, growth-minded guy. And I chose Lou Gerstner, the man who came in and saved IBM. And Anne Mulcahy, the woman who brought Xerox back to life, as contrasts to Alfred Dunlap and the other turnaround expert. Jack Welch, Lou Gerstner, and Anne Mulcahy are also fascinating because they transformed their companies. They did this by rooting out the fixed mindset and putting a culture of growth and teamwork in its place. With Gerstner and IBM, it's like watching Enron morph into a growth mindset mecca. As growth-minded leaders, they start with a belief in human potential and development, both their own and other people's. Instead of using the company as a vehicle for their greatness, they use it as an engine of growth for themselves, the employees, and the company as a whole. Warren Bennis has said that too many bosses are driven and driving but going nowhere. Not these people. They don't talk royalty. They talk journey, an inclusive, learning-filled, rollicking journey. Jack. Listening, crediting, nurturing. When Jack Welch took over GE in 1980, the company was valued at $14 billion. 20 years later, it was valued by Wall Street at $490 billion. It was the most valuable company in the world. Fortune magazine called Welch the most widely admired, studied, and imitated CEO of his time. His total economic impact is impossible to calculate, but it must be a staggering multiple of his GE performance. But to me, even more impressive was an op-ed piece in the New York Times by Steve Bennett, the CEO of Intuit. I learned about nurturing employees from my time at General Electric from Jack Welch. He'd go directly to the frontline employee to figure out what was going on. Sometime in the early 1990s, I saw him in a factory where they made refrigerators in Louisville. He went right to the workers in the assembly line to hear what they had to say. I do frequent CEO chats with frontline employees. I learned that from Jack. This vignette says a lot. Jack was obviously a busy guy, an important guy, but he didn't run things like Iacocca from the luxurious corporate headquarters where his most frequent contacts were the white-gloved waiters. Welch never stopped visiting the factories and hearing from the workers. These were the people he respected, learned from, and in turn, nurtured. Then there is the emphasis on teamwork, not the royal I. Right away, right from the dedication and the author's note of Welch's autobiography, you know something is different. It's not the I'm a hero of Lee Iacocca, or the I'm a superstar of Alfred Dunlap, although he could easily lay claim to both. Instead, it's, I hate having to use the first person. Nearly everything I've done in my life has been accomplished with other people. Please remember that every time you see the word I in these pages, it refers to all those colleagues and friends and some I might have missed. Or, these people filled my journey with great fun and learning. They often made me look better than I am. Already we see the me of the validation-hungry CEO becoming the we and us of the growth-minded leader. Interestingly, before Welch could root the fixed mindset out of the company, he had to root it out of himself. And believe me, Welch had a long way to go. He was not always the leader he learned to be. In 1971, Welch was being considered for a promotion when the head of GE Human Resources wrote a cautioning memo. He noted that despite Welch's many strengths, the appointment carries with it more than the usual degree of risk. He went on to say that Welch was arrogant, couldn't take criticism, and depended too much on his talent instead of hard work and his knowledgeable staff. Not good signs. Fortunately, every time his success went to his head, he got a wake-up call. One day, young Dr. Welch, decked out in his fancy suit, got into his new convertible. He proceeded to put the top down and was promptly squirted with dark, grungy oil that ruined both his suit and the paint job on his beloved car. There I was, thinking I was larger than life, and smack came the reminder that brought me back to reality. It was a great lesson. There is a whole chapter titled Too Full of Myself about the time he was on an acquisition roll and felt he could do no wrong. Then he bought Kidder Peabody, a Wall Street investment banking firm with an Enron-type culture. It was a disaster that lost hundreds of millions of dollars for GE. The Kidder experience never left me. It taught him that there's only a razor's edge between self-confidence and hubris. This time hubris won and taught me a lesson I would never forget. What he learned was this: true self-confidence is the courage to be open, to welcome change and new ideas regardless of their source. Real self-confidence is not reflected in a title, an expensive suit, a fancy car, or a series of acquisitions. It is reflected in your mindset, your readiness to grow. Well, humility is a start. But what about the management skills? From his experiences, Welch learned more and more about the kind of manager he wanted to be. A growth-minded manager, a guide, not a judge. When Welch was a young engineer at GE, he caused a chemical explosion that blew the roof off the building he worked in. Emotionally shaken by what happened, he nervously drove the 100 miles to company headquarters to face the music and explain himself to the boss. But when he got there, the treatment he received was understanding and supportive. He never forgot it. Charlie's reaction made a huge impression on me. If we're managing good people who are clearly eating themselves up over an error, our job is to help them through it. He learned how to select people for their mindset, not their pedigrees. Originally, academic pedigrees impressed him. He hired engineers from MIT, Princeton, and Caltech. But after a while, he realized that wasn't what counted. Eventually, I learned that I was really looking for people who were filled with passion and a desire to get things done. A resume didn't tell me much about that inner hunger. Then came a chance to become the CEO. Each of the 3 candidates had to convince the reigning CEO he was best for the job. Welch made the pitch on the basis of his capacity to grow. He didn't claim that he was a genius or that he was the greatest leader who ever lived. He promised to develop. He got the job and made good on his promise. Immediately, he opened up dialogue and the channels for honest feedback. He quickly set to work asking executives what they liked and disliked about the company, and what they thought needed changing. Boy, were they surprised. In fact, they'd been so used to kissing up to the bosses that they couldn't even get their minds around these questions. Then he spread the word. This company is about growth, not self-importance. He shut down elitism, quite the opposite of our fixed mindset leaders. One evening, Welch addressed an elite executive club at GE that was the place for movers and shakers to see and be seen. To their shock, he did not tell them how wonderful they were. He told them, "I can't find any value in what you're doing." Instead, he asked them to think of a role that made more sense for them and for the company. A month later, the president of the club came to Welch with a new idea: to turn the club into a force of community volunteers. 20 years later, that program, open to all employees, had 42,000 members. They were running mentoring programs in inner-city schools and building parks, playgrounds, and libraries for communities in need. They were now making a contribution to others' growth, not to their own egos. He got rid of brutal bosses. Iacocca tolerated and even admired brutal bosses who could make the workers produce. It served his bottom line. Welch admitted that he, too, had often looked the other way. But in the organization he now envisioned, he could not do that. In front of 500 managers, I explained why 4 corporate officers were asked to leave during the prior year, even though they delivered good financial performance. They were asked to go because they didn't practice our values. The approved way to foster productivity was now through mentoring, not through terror. And he rewarded teamwork rather than individual genius. For years, GE, like Enron, had rewarded the single originator of an idea, but now Welch wanted to reward the team that brought the ideas to fruition. As a result, leaders were encouraged to share the credit for ideas with their teams, rather than take full credit themselves. It made a huge difference in how we all related to one another. Jack Welch was not a perfect person, but he was devoted to growth. This devotion kept his ego in check, kept him connected to reality, and kept him in touch with his humanity. In the end, it made his journey prosperous and fulfilling for thousands of people. Blue, rooting out the fixed mindset. By the late 1980s, IBM had become Enron, with one exception. The board of directors knew it was in trouble. It had a culture of smugness and elitism. Within the company, it was the old, "we are royalty, but I'm more royal than you are" syndrome. There was no teamwork, only turf wars. There were deals, but no follow-up. There was no concern for the customer. Yet this probably wouldn't have bothered anyone if business weren't suffering. In 1993, they turned to Lou Gerstner and asked him to be the new CEO. He said no. They asked him again. "You owe it to America. We're going to have President Clinton call and tell you to take the job. Please, please, please. We want exactly the kind of strategy and culture change you created at American Express and RJR." In the end, he caved, although he can't remember why. But IBM now had a leader who believed in personal growth and in creating a corporate culture that would foster it. How did he produce it at IBM? First, as Welch had done, he opened the channels of communication up and down the company. 6 days after he arrived, he sent a memo to every IBM worker telling them, "Over the next few months, I plan to visit as many of our operations and offices as I can. And whenever possible, I plan to meet with many of you to talk about how together we can strengthen the company." He dedicated his book to them. This book is dedicated to the thousands of IBMers who never gave up on their company, their colleagues, and themselves. They are the real heroes of the reinvention of IBM. As Welch had done, he attacked the elitism. Like Enron, the whole culture was about grappling for personal status within the company. Gerstner disbanded the management committee, the ultimate power role for IBM executives, and often went outside the upper echelons for expertise. From a growth mindset, it's not only the select few that have something to offer. Hierarchy means very little to me. Let's put together in meetings the people who can help solve a problem, regardless of position. Then came teamwork. Gerstner fired politicians, those who indulged in internal intrigue, and instead rewarded people who helped their colleagues. He stopped IBM sales divisions from putting each other down to clients to win business for themselves. He started basing executives' bonuses more on IBM's overall performance and less on the performance of their individual units. The message? We're not looking to crown a few princes. We need to work as a team. As at Enron, the deal was the glamorous thing. The rest was pedestrian. pedestrian. Gerstner was appalled by the endless failure to follow through on deals and decisions, and the company's unlimited tolerance of it. He demanded and inspired better execution. Message: genius is not enough. We need to get the job done. Finally, Gerstner focused on the customer. IBM customers felt betrayed and angry. IBM was so into itself that it was no longer serving their computer needs. They were upset about pricing. They were frustrated by the bureaucracy at IBM. They were irritated that IBM was not helping them to integrate their systems. At a meeting of 175 chief information officers of the largest U.S. companies, Gerstner announced that IBM would now put the customer first, and backed it up by announcing a drastic cut in their mainframe computer prices. Message: we are not hereditary royalty. We serve at the pleasure of our clients. At the end of his first 3 arduous months, Gerstner received his report card from Wall Street. IBM stock has done nothing, because he has done nothing. Ticked off but undaunted, Gerstner continued his anti-royalty campaign and brought IBM back from its near-death experience. This was the sprint. This is when Dunlap would have taken his money and run. What lay ahead was the even harder task of maintaining his policies until IBM regained industry leadership. That was the marathon. By the time he gave IBM back to the IBMers in March 2002, the stock had increased in value by 800%, and IBM was #1 in the world in IT services, hardware, enterprise software, excluding PCs, and custom-designed high-performance computer chips. What's more, IBM was once again defining the future direction of the industry. Anne. Learning, toughness, and compassion. Take IBM, plunge it into debt to the tune of $17 billion, destroy its credit rating, make it the target of SEC investigations, and drop its stock from $63.69 to $4.43 a share. What do you get? Xerox. That was the Xerox Anne Mulcahy took over in 2000. Not only had the company failed to diversify, it could no longer even sell its copy machines. But 3 years later, Xerox had had 4 straight profitable quarters, and in 2004, Fortune named Mulcahy the hottest turnaround act since Lou Gerstner. How did she do it? She went into an incredible learning mode, making herself into the CEO Xerox needed to survive. She and her top people, like Ursula Burns, learned the nitty-gritty of every part of the business. For example, as Fortune writer Betsy Morris explains, Mulcahy took Balance Sheet 101. She learned about debt, inventory, taxes, and currency, so she could predict how each decision she made would play out on the balance sheet. Every weekend she took home large binders and pored over them, as though her final exam was on Monday. When she took the helm, people at Xerox units couldn't give her simple answers about what they had, what they sold, or who was in charge. She became a CEO who knew those answers, or knew where to get them. She was tough. She told everyone the cold, hard truth they didn't want to know, like how the Xerox business model was not viable, or how close the company was to running out of money. She cut the employee rolls by 30%, but she was no chainsaw Al. Instead, she bore the emotional brunt of her decisions, roaming the halls, hanging out with the employees, and saying, "I'm sorry." She was tough but compassionate. In fact, she'd wake up in the middle of the night worrying about what would happen to the remaining employees and retirees if the company folded. She worried constantly about the morale and development of her people, so that even with the cuts, she refused to sacrifice the unique and wonderful parts of the Xerox culture. Xerox was known throughout the industry as the company that gave retirement parties and hosted retiree reunions. As the employees struggled side by side with her, she refused to abolish their raises and, in a morale-boosting gesture, gave them all their birthdays off. She wanted to save the company in body and spirit, and not for herself or her ego, but for all her people who were stretching themselves to the limit for the company. After slaving away for 2 years, Mulcahy opened Time magazine only to see a picture of herself grouped with the notorious heads of Tyco and WorldCom, men responsible for 2 of the biggest corporate management disasters of our time. But a year later, she knew her hard work was finally paying off when one of her board members, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, told her, "I never thought I would be proud to have my name associated with this company again." I was wrong. Mulcahy was winning the sprint. Next came the marathon. Could Xerox win that too? Maybe it had rested on its laurels too long, resisting change and letting too many chances go by. Or maybe the growth mindset, Mulcahy's mission to transform herself and her company, would help save another American institution. Jack, Lou, and Anne, all believing in growth, all brimming with passion, and all believing that leadership is about growth and passion, not about brilliance. The fixed mindset leaders were, in the end, full of bitterness, but the growth-minded leaders were full of gratitude. They looked up with gratitude to their workers who had made their amazing journey possible. They called them the real heroes. Are CEO and male synonymous? When you look at the books written by and about CEOs, you would think so. Jim Collins's Good to Great Leaders and his comparison Not So Great Leaders were all men. Perhaps that's because men are the ones who've been at the top for a long while. A few years ago, you'd have been hard-pressed to think of women at the top of big companies. In fact, many women who've run big companies had to create them, like Mary Kay Ash, the cosmetics tycoon, Martha Stewart, or Oprah Winfrey, or inherit them, like Katharine Graham, the former head of the Washington Post. Things are beginning to change. Women now hold more key positions in big business. They've been the CEOs not only of Xerox, but also eBay, Hewlett-Packard, Viacom's MTV Networks, Time Warner's Time, Incorporated, Lucent Technologies, and Rite Aid. Women have been the presidents or chief financial officers of Citigroup, PepsiCo, and Verizon. In fact, Fortune magazine called Meg Whitman of eBay maybe the best CEO in America, of the world's hottest company. I wonder whether, in a few years, I'll be able to write this whole chapter with women as the main characters. On the other hand, I hope not. I hope that in a few years it will be hard to find fixed mindset leaders, men or women, at the top of our most important companies. A study of group processes. Researcher Robert Wood and his colleagues did another great study. This time they created management groups, 30 groups with 3 people each. Half of the groups had 3 people with a fixed mindset, and half had 3 people with a growth mindset. Those with the fixed mindset believed that people have a certain fixed amount of management ability, and they cannot do much to change it. In contrast, those with the growth mindset believed people can always substantially change their basic skills for managing other people. So one group thought you have it or you don't, the other thought your skills could grow with experience. Every group had worked together for some weeks when they were given, jointly, the task I talked about before, a complex management task in which they ran a simulated organization, a furniture company. If you remember, on this task people had to figure out how to match workers with jobs and how to motivate them for maximum productivity. But this time, instead of working individually, people could discuss their choices and the feedback they got, and work together to improve their decisions. The fixed and growth mindset groups started with the same ability. But as time went on, the growth mindset groups clearly outperformed the fixed mindset ones. And this difference became ever larger the longer the groups worked. Once again, those with the growth mindset profited from their mistakes and feedback far more than the fixed mindset people. But what was even more interesting was how the groups functioned. The members of the growth mindset groups were much more likely to state their honest opinions and openly express their disagreements as they communicated about their management decisions. Everyone was part of the learning process. For the fixed mindset groups, with their concern about who was smart or dumb, or their anxiety about disapproval for their ideas, that open, productive discussion did not happen. Instead, it was more like groupthink. Groupthink versus we think. In the early 1970s, Irving Janis popularized the term groupthink. It's when everyone in the group starts thinking alike. No one disagrees. No one takes a critical stance. It can lead to catastrophic decisions, and as the Wood study suggests, it often can come right out of a fixed mindset. Groupthink can occur when people put unlimited faith in a talented leader, a genius,